Welcome back to the archives for the final round of the Evangel October Open. At this point, I'm sitting at 2 out of 3 and playing for the second place prize. I was paired against my friend Kristian in this round. He is lower rated, but he's been on the rise, and I needed to take this game seriously. I had the white pieces, and I knew he played the French, and I decided to play the Tarrasch, which is an opening I have never played as white before. So in this tournament, I've got multiple games where I'm playing things for the first time, trying to broaden my skill set. But it is an opening I have faced many times from the black side, and it can be challenging to face. My record, especially against higher rated players that play it, is not ideal. Often their strategy is give me an isolated pawn and then win the game. So I was going to see if I could put forth that same strategy. Give Kristian the isolated pawn and therefore win the game. However, this did play into something that Kristian had mentioned earlier, saying that he enjoys playing with the isolated pawn more than his opponent having it. So I took the challenge. I gave him the isolated pawn, and we reached this position right here. A pretty normal position where black backs their bishop up. So black has an isolated d-pawn, but has pretty easy development. We can see there's no bad French bishop. And so the general plans for each side are black wants to create an initiative, create play, keep the minor pieces on the board. And white wants to control the d-pawn. They want to control that d4 square so the pawn can't advance or sacrifice itself. We want to blockade it at some point, probably with one of our knights. c3 is a likely move at some point. And then trading off the minor pieces is definitely a goal of white's. Trading off major pieces typically is going to favor black. The queen can go either way, but definitely rooks is going to favor the person with the isolated pawn, because the easiest way to win this position is to trade off the knights and bishops, put your queen and rooks on the file of the isolated pawn, and win the isolated pawn. And so if black can trade rooks, then it's harder for white to win that isolated pawn. So this is kind of an ideal setup for white in terms of where we want our pieces. You can see we've got good control over that d4 square, but it can be hard to actually force anything. We kind of have to wait to see how black tries to create the initiative. And so I played the move h3. And black played the strong move queen d6. This is a strong move because it gets out of any possibility of bishop g5, pinning the knight to the queen, and at least trading off a set of minor pieces. So when Kristian played this move, I was definitely like, all right, I don't think I really have an advantage as white at this point. I don't think I played the move order ideally since I've never looked at this from the white side. And it is just completely equal at this point. The lead chess computer saying 0.1 for black. So definitely no edge here for white, but the position's still comfortable. And I played c3 just to control that d4 square again. And this position is actually already tricky for white. And I wasn't sure in this position whether or not black could get away with a move like bishop takes h3. And if we go back here, while h3 is not objectively bad, in this position, white does have to be careful because it opens up sacrifices on h3 for the rest of the game. And in fact, after c3, black can capture the pawn. And even though it's holdable for white, I looked at the defense, and there's no way I would have found it over the board, I don't think. It's very challenging. So just to show you what happens, he did not play bishop captures h3. He played rook to e8, a very natural move, the move I kind of expected in that position. But bishop takes h3. I have to capture. Queen g3 check. Because the f-pawn is pinned. And so this is a theme we're going to see for basically the rest of the game, is that both my opponent and I underestimated the idea of this pin. the bishop on b6, pinning that f-pawn. So that's actually going to be a recurring theme. So bishop to g3. And they start to bring a knight over to g4. I've got to protect that g4 square. They go into f3, and I cannot capture this knight. So if I capture this knight, then bishop c7 leads to checkmate. There's no way for me to defend the h2 square. And so I would instead have to play the move bishop to f4. And that's the only way to defend h2. And in this position, it's even. Black is going to reroute their knight. They're going to go after g2. I'm going to have to play the bishop to f3. But every move, I only have, at best, equality. I think if I defend perfectly, Black's probably going to get some kind of perpetual, perhaps. But kind of a crazy defense that I have to be careful of bishop to c7 leading to a forced mate. So that would have been a devastating move to face. Fortunately, my opponent, I don't know if they considered it or not on this move or later, but they did not play it, and they went ahead with the move rook to e8. So up to this point, I don't feel like I've played poorly. H3 probably isn't the most accurate move, and I don't have an advantage, but I haven't made any glaring mistakes, but neither has Black. And as a result, they've created an initiative, they've got some good development, and White is just in trouble from here on out. I play the move bishop to g5, which is not as effective as it would have been earlier because there's no longer a pin on the queen. Right, if that queen was still on d8, I could play bishop on g5, and then I could take on f6. Yes, I'm giving up the bishop pair, but remember, playing against the isolated pawn, I want to get rid of minor pieces, so that trade would have been fine. And Black played h6. Knight to e4 would have been the strongest move for Black, keeping that knight on the board, and then if I trade my light squared bishop, they can go ahead and get that rook involved. That would have been probably the strongest move if they want to save the knight. Now, if we're talking about objectively the strongest according to the computer, we have bishop takes h3 again, which I did not consider in this position. I thought about it on the previous move and discarded it. I wasn't really thinking about it here. I thought they were going to deal with this knight somehow. So bishop takes h3. I take the knight if I want to survive, because if I take here, I just get checked all over the place. And we get a very similar position with bishop c7 showing up, and it's just very ugly for White. So I would have to take on f6, and then they play queen to g3 again, threatening checkmate on g2. Right, so now the bishop is under attack, the queen is under attack, but I can't really take either one of them. So I've got to go bishop captures h7, giving up my bishop, and then I try and defend everything like this. And we reach this position where I have made the material equal, but the position is better for Black. They're going to bring their rook down. I've got the weaknesses on the king side. Probably practically equal in practical play, but not very pleasant for all those pieces to come off the board, and I be left with two isolated pawns also. Note that the f-pawn is still pinned. The g-file being open probably favors Black if their king moves to the queen side. Their knight has a nice square on e5, so don't really love this position. So once again, bishop takes h3 exclam was possible. But my opponent did not play it. Not sure if they considered it. I did not consider it on this move. They played h6. And after h6, I should simply take the knight. Take the knight, admit that I'm not any better, and go on from there. But I played the move bishop to h4. And now the position is just lost for White. Bishop h4 is a losing move. So take a moment. How does Black win this position? Get a winning advantage, decisive right now. You can pause the video if you'd like. So if you're thinking bishop captures h3 now, it's not bad. We still have a very similar position. They're going to go ahead and force my bishop back and capture on g3, and black is a little bit better. However, they don't even have to give up the bishop to get that kind of position. Instead, g5 immediately. My bishop has to go here, and they capture. And if I capture on g5, then they take back, and I can't really take with the knight because they still have queen to g3 coming up, hitting the knight. They're looking to play bishop takes h3 in some positions. Their second knight's coming to e5, and it's just super ugly for white. So g5, and white can basically resign. Now, I would not have resigned. I would have played on, especially in this time control. Remember, this is game in 45, increment 10. So we're basically starting in time pressure if you're a classical player. My opponent did not play g5. They played the move knight to e5, another very reasonable move. I captured. They recaptured the rook. And here I continued my blundering ways. And I just played bishop to g3. I thought, oh, this is really nice. I kicked the queen off the diagonal, and I'm going to be fighting for that e5 square. I might even be better again. And of course, my opponent would be able to simply take the bishop, but as you've seen so far in this game, both my opponent and I completely oblivious to the fact that the f-pawn is pinned. And so, as soon as I played this move, I realized that my opponent could take it, and I knew I couldn't keep a straight face. So I actually got up from the board, walked away from the board, and thought, all right, if he takes it, he takes it. You know, we'll try and figure out if there's anything to do from there. But let's see what he does first. And after a couple of minutes, my opponent played the move queen to e6. And now white's not even worse anymore. So I still have my bishop. Now it's suddenly on an okay square. And white's doing perfectly fine. Now, black's not really much worse in this position because they do have the e-file, but the queen on e6 does block the bishop. So I think white has a small edge. However, I now spend the next couple of moves reflecting on the fact that I blundered this bishop. So I make some more moves, and knight to e2, rook to e2, and actually I think in this position after knight f to d2, black doesn't even have to move this rook. They can just play the move f4, and I think I'm still getting crushed. Right, what is it? My bishop retreats, they attack my queen, and they play f3. So position's still completely lost. So after blundering my bishop and not losing it, I just proceed to play some very subpar moves. And then here in my head, I had moved the other knight. Again, still thinking about that bishop. And if my knight's still on f3, then I'm guarding e1. But since I moved the f knight, there's nothing guarding e1. And I just blunder the rook. And so I'm just trying to get rid of all my pieces as quickly as possible. You know, like this is a bullet game or bug house or something. But it's not. It's a classical game. And my opponent thinks for just a moment and then takes my rook. So now I'm just down a clean rook. So I've got a couple of choices here. I could just resign, and since we were carpooling, we could just head home early, which was definitely a legitimate option. And if it was game in 90, I would have done that. I would have been headed home, make sure we get back for dinner, and have a nice car ride. But this was game in 45. I did already have a time advantage, not surprisingly. Because I'm obviously not thinking very much about these moves, apparently. And so I figured I would play on. So what do we do in this position? We're down material, but there are a lot of pieces on the board. So how do I create play? I need to keep as many pieces on the board. I need to go after their king. And as long as their extra rook does not join the fight, I'm not down material. Remember, if you are down material and their extra material is not developed, you aren't down material. Not until that piece enters the game. And if you are up material and you haven't developed your extra material, you can't play like you're up material, because you're not up material until that material enters the game. And so my goal is to keep this rook on the A8 square as long as possible. So I need to create as many threats, as many complications, so that black does not have time to develop that rook. That's the goal. Now, obviously, if black plays well, they are simply winning. I don't have any compensation for the rook. I'm not going to pretend to. But in a practical game, we can make it more complicated. So right here, my opponent is thinking, okay, well, he's probably thinking that my king is on h2, I'm still vulnerable, and he wants to attack. And so he plays the move g5, which objectively, computer approved, nothing wrong with that move. But from a human standpoint, I think this was a big mistake. Perhaps the biggest mistake of the game. For black. Obviously not for white, because I gave up the rook. Because what this does is it creates space around the black king. So now if black does not play accurately, their king is going to be vulnerable. In fact, if they play accurately, their king might still be vulnerable because they've created that extra space. I think what makes the most sense, the safest way to play here, is simply a move like bishop to d7 and develop the rook to one of these files. Then there's nothing white can do. Then I can basically resign. But as soon as g5 was on the board, I started licking my chops. I'm like, all right, look at that king all by itself. How do I open up it more? Not worried about losing more material. Remember, if you're down material, you can just give up more material because it doesn't matter, right? If you're down a piece or 2 pieces or a rook in an endgame, it's all the same. So I'm not worried about keeping the material I have. I'm not worried about, anything positional. That doesn't matter now. All that matters is how do I create chances. So let's open up the king side. Get an attack on the queen. And we can see that now white has the initiative. In this position right here, I expected the move queen to g7 or queen to g6, blocking the file. And if I ever took, they would trade queens and their king could swoop up the pawn. Thought this was the second moment where black kind of gave me more play than they needed to. Because this allows me to take with check, and in an open position like this, it's hard to calculate all the checks. It's just very difficult, especially if we're talking about calculating the checks in the future moves. So I thought that was a little unnecessary, and as a result, I'm feeling pretty good about this position. Do I know I'm lost? Yes, but I know there are chances now. Now things, like I can imagine positions where it's a draw or they get checkmated. So I was feeling rejuvenated. They play queen to g7 and queen to h5. And my idea was to threaten some kind of perpetual on this diagonal. Now there's not actually a perpetual. The king can kind of get away. But it's definitely a threat and something for black to think about. All we're doing is posing problems for black. So at the very least, they've got to take time. So their clock is ticking all the time because all the initiative and pressure is on black right now. And that rook is still in the corner. And black plays this check. And they play f4. Now they kind of have to create room for the bishop because the bishop can't go to d7 anymore. So we can see that knight on c5, that tempo we got against the queen, is continuing to hamper black's development. Throw in some checks. Attack the queen, throw in another check, and now they got their bishop developed. And we go after the queen again, and they play queen to e4. So I'm playing queen and 2 knights versus the king. Their king is on e7. I don't think there's going to be any kind of checkmate. So my best bet is to create chances to fork their pieces. So that's really what we're looking for here, is to create forks. So I played the move c4. I actually thought for a while on this move because I thought that in this position, black had solved all their problems. I thought they did a really good job up to this point. They did take a lot of time to do it, but black has avoided all of the threats that I had against their king and their pieces, and they basically consolidated in this position. They're going to move their rook into the game next, and there's not a lot I can do about it. And so I was feeling like now it's almost time to start thinking about resigning again. And I went ahead and I played c4, which is basically hope chess, right? And sometimes when you're losing, you have to play hope chess. So I played c4. And the reason I thought this move was interesting is they can't take the free knight because then I win the queen. And if they just play like a random move, then this fork is actually really powerful. And I'm not even sure I'm worse after taking this, am I? No, I'm actually better after this fork. And so we're posing a couple of problems, and black did solve it correctly by taking the pawn, which there wasn't much I could do about that, but I needed to at least put them in a position where they could go wrong. And I throw in another check. And I go back to h4, and the idea here is that I'm trying to control that f5 square, and I want to keep this knight defended now that I don't have any discoveries. The bishop's pinned, so they can't take my knight. And the knight is actually very strong on g4, not just because we're pinning the king with the queen, but because now if they ever develop the rook to the g file, I just get a fork. And if I get that fork in, then I am golden. I'm going to be getting material back. Their king's still going to be exposed. That would be wonderful. And so they can't develop the rook to g8. They can't develop it to h8. They can't develop it to f8. They can't develop it to e8 because of the same fork. They could develop it to the d8 square behind the king. I think they could get away with that. Yeah, because I don't think I've got any good checks here. But this whole king side, they can't develop to. So they play knight f5, trying to trade off the knights, trying to kick my queen away. Queen d2 check. Queen f4 check. And I bring that knight back into the game. Now, if they develop to c8, well, there's not a fork. Oh, wait, there is. Yeah, so the threat right now is queen captures knight. If I capture the knight, so imagine they develop their rook, let's say to any square, then I have queen takes knight, and then the fork. Maybe that's not strong enough. So maybe at this moment they could. So they can't develop to the G file because I do have a fork or I don't. Yeah, I do have a fork. Okay, so it's not this fork. It's actually the other knight that I have the fork with now. So many possible forks in this position, very hard to keep track of, which is exactly what I wanted, of course. So, yeah, they still can't go there. They still can't go here. They can't go here because of my knight covering. I guess they could develop to the D file now, and that was probably their best move. Just develop, double up on the file, and try and trade things off. So they played the queen back, trying to trade off the queens, pinning my queen to the king. And I went ahead and checked the king. And then I played g3 just to get off that diagonal, break that pin. And at this point, my opponent played rook g8. So they've solved all their issues now. They've developed the rook finally. However, it took them a long time to do so. And in fact, after they played the move rook to g8, my opponent offered a draw, which was completely reasonable because they had just gone under a minute on the clock. And so, is this position winning for black? Yes. Does black want to play this position versus a queen and two knights with less than a minute on their clock? No. They'll take the draw. I thought briefly, should I play this on? But with a 10-second increment, I didn't think it was worth it. So I accepted the draw. Well played the black. And so my opening was very poor, of course, losing material many different ways. But after I lost that rook, I was pretty happy with my play. I created a lot of complications and a lot of initiative and prevented them from using their extra material. From Black's perspective, they should be very happy with their opening. And then they let me get a little more counterplay than they needed to. They played objectively good moves, but they gave me more chances. And so they weren't able to use their extra material, even though they defended everything perfectly. And they never fell for any tricks. There was never a moment where I was getting back in the game. They just put themselves in a position where they had to be extra careful. And in the end, it was a draw. I ended up taking second place in the tournament. So not too bad of a tournament for myself. However, everyone in the section lost 2 to 5 rating points, except for my opponent here, Kristian, who ended up taking more than 20 rating points home after not winning a game. He actually had 3 draws, but he drew me and the top seed, the state champ, Chibuzo. So really a great day from Kristian because he drew that game from a better position also. So definitely a good performance for him. I was satisfied with how the game ended up for me. It could have been a lot worse, so we move on. Very exciting tournament, very exciting game. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Next, we'll be taking a look at the tournament I played last weekend, and I'll be getting those games up. I'm also playing another tournament tomorrow. And yeah, there's lots of chess happening right now, right in the midst of 5 or 6 weekends in a row. So lots of games to learn from. All right, good luck in your games and your studies. Feel free to comment with any questions you had about the game or about chess in general, or any suggestions. Always open to suggestions, what I could do to make these videos better, or certain content you want to see. Just let me know. All right, thank you. Good luck in your games.